Well, hello and welcome to Transform Tuesday. My name is Dave McCormick. I'm VP of Products and Services here at Alpha Software. And today we're going to be talking, of course, about Alpha Transform, but we're going to be continuing our discussion on ETL. That's extract, transfer, and load. And we're going to get into a little bit more detail. So today is kind of a technical session. I'm also here to answer your questions as well. So if you do have questions, go ahead and type them into the questions box of the GoToWebinar control panel. All right, so let's get started. I think I'm down here at slide 243. Here we go. So for those of you who joined us last week, I was talking, not last week, the week before last. We didn't have one last week. 2 weeks ago, we were talking about extract, transform, and load. And that's the process of copying data from one data source, manipulating it as necessary, and putting it into another data source. And we talked about why you would want to do this. And the example that we gave has to do with an application that we're building, and maybe an application similar to one that you're building. And ours is called a field service solution. So what that is instead of just using Transform Central in order to do all of your back office stuff, we've actually built out a whole new web portal, which gives us things that Transform Central doesn't, such as a dashboard and reports, and also a more fancy way of dispatching records, forms to people who are out in the field. Also can give us metrics and other information as well. So that is all things that we'd want to do with the web portal. And as we dive into that, so why use ETL? You'll see that there's actually quite a lot of times in which we want to be touching and manipulating the data that we get from Transform, whether it's populating these performance widgets or it's tying into your CRM to find customers that you're going to dispatch a service request to the review screens, which let you export data. There's going to be a lot of data manipulation. So if we relied purely on the Transform API, we'd have two limitations. The first limitation is that, or three limitations. The first is that it's slower than using a SQL database. And the reason it's slower is because the web call itself also connects to a SQL database in the background. So you're adding in a middle layer, which is this web service here, whose job it is basically to process your requests. That's not nearly as fast as going directly to a SQL database. The second thing is that there are some limitations into how much you can search and how many records you're even allowed to bring back at once from the API. And those limitations are gone when you load it into your own SQL database. And the third reason, well, actually, those are really the two key ones. So we're going to move on. So I had mentioned before that Alpha Anywhere has a way of, Alpha Transform has a way of automatically submitting data to a SQL backend. Actually, it's got a couple, one of which is using a Zapier integration, which we didn't really talk about. But a more popular way is using the onSubmit action, which is built right into Alpha Anywhere. And in fact, into Alpha Transform. And in fact, Alpha Anywhere, which is Transform's companion product, has a tool that lets you build that onSubmit action that you'll use in Transform. And it just walks you right through. You build a connection string and all that. Now, the reason I'm not going to use that in my application is it has a limitation. And that is, as of right now anyway, if it tries to send a record to a SQL database and it fails, you don't get any notification about it. It just doesn't show up in the database. And what that means is that your SQL database that you're using for dashboarding and dispatch and other things becomes out of date. The next thing is, hang on one second. Oh, I'm getting pinged here. Can I ask just a quick question? Is my voice coming through? Are you guys seeing stuff? No, you're not. All right, I'm getting pinged. Oh boy. Well, don't worry. I'm only 4 minutes into it. I'm going to do a quick review. Hang on a second. All right. One more time. Starting up here. Sorry, those were some pretty good screens. Although if you were here 2 weeks ago, they're screens you've seen before. So what I was basically going to say is, if you're building out something like an Alpha Field Services solution, you're probably going to want to have your own SQL database so that you can do some more complex things like do key performance indicator widgets and graphing and reports. And the reason you want to do that is because it's faster and it's more flexible. Okay, so moving on, I talked about the fact that Alpha Anywhere has a built-in ability, or Alpha Transform has a built-in ability to submit to a SQL database, but that it's limited. And if it fails, the data will not go in. So instead, I've decided that I'm going to write my own just little script whose job it is to periodically check to see if there are updates and update the SQL database. So let's talk a little bit about that. In fact, let's talk about it in terms of the context of how data is going to move between SQL and Transform. So starting on this side, imagine we're here. This looks like a dashboard screen, but imagine we're at a dispatch screen right here. And someone has called up to report that they need this. Imagine this is for a HVAC company. So someone's called up to say, hey, my heat's not working. Can you send someone out to fix my heat? So what they would do, what the administrator would do, is they would open up the dispatch screen. They would find the customer in the database. It could be linked to their current CRM system, or you could just have your own database in the back end that handled that. You type in information about the customer, where they're located. You choose a convenient time that you have scheduled, that you have time and that works for the customer, and then you click a submit button. When that data is submitted, it actually goes to different places. The first place it goes is to a SQL database, and in this one we call that table in the SQL database the service calls table. And in the service calls table, there is a key field called SampleID. It could have been service call ID. That probably would have been a better name. But anyway, that's what we've called it in our SQL table. Once that's written and we've got that key field, the next thing that our dispatch screen does is it creates a record in Transform, or creates a new form instance in Transform using the API. And in that form instance, it also stores the customer's name and what time the person is supposed to show up, and what the problem is they're supposed to investigate, and other information, as well as that key field, that SampleID field, so that both Transform and the SQL table have something in common later on. Okay, so that's data coming out of the system and going into Transform. Now let's look at it the other way around, and let's look at taking data in from Transform. So imagine, we'll go back to the other one, that the person is out in the field, they've collected information, they've posted it to the Transform database, or to the Transform cloud. And then every once in a while, maybe it's every 30 seconds, every minute or so, a process kicks off. And what it does is it looks at the SQL database for whatever the latest timestamp is. So let's talk about timestamp. Timestamp is a field that's automatically created in Transform, and it keeps track of the last time the record has been written to or edited. So when you first create a record, a timestamp is assigned right at that time. If you go back and edit a form in Transform, that timestamp is updated, and that's how you know when the last time that record was touched. Now, what we're going to do when we look in the SQL database is we find out the last time that happened. Maybe the last time that happened was 3 minutes ago. So what we'll do is we'll do a query of the Transform API for all of the records with a timestamp that's 3 minutes ago or even more recently. We'll pull down those records and we'll update the SQL table, and we'll update the timestamp at the same time with the data, and then that's it. So to put this in context, let's kind of take a quick look at the underlying data structure. So let's pop over here. Here's a screenshot I have from Navicat. These fields might be a little bit hard to read, but I'll just sort of list through them real quick. There's that SampleID, that key field I told you about before. There's the call time. That's when the caller called in to report that they had some sort of issue. Here's all the information about the caller, what their name is, their address, email, phone, things like that. It also keeps track of which technician was assigned to it and all of that. And there are some fields down here at the bottom, for example, check 1, check 2, check 3, check 4, which are information that will be filled out later on in the field by the technician, and that data needs to be merged back into the SQL database so that we can do reporting and stuff on that. Okay, so the question is, how do we do it? And I took many of you through a lot of this a couple weeks ago when I said, okay, and I'm going to actually dive into the code, but I didn't have the code ready. But today I have the code ready, and I can explain how to do this because it's actually not that complicated. To begin with, I created a function whose job is to see when the last record was updated in my SQL table. If I look at the flowchart, that's the first thing on my list. Query the SQL database for the latest timestamp. And that's just a very easy SQL statement. So the SQL statement is select the first one timestamp from the service calls table in which it's been ordered by timestamp in descending order. And what that will return at the end is a timestamp. So it'll give me a T. It'll say, okay, 2 minutes ago is the last time we updated the SQL database, or 5 minutes ago, or yesterday, or whatever it is. It'll come back as a time. So that was one of the functions. It's one of the 3 functions that we're going to use today. The second function has to do with actually calling the transform API. So if you recall, whoops, skip down here, we now know what the timestamp is. What we want to do is we want to ask transform for all of the records that have been updated since that timestamp. And to do that, I'm going to use the API, but I'm not going to write the code myself. I'm going to use the companion product, Alpha Anywhere, and its Transform API Explorer to write that code for me. So of all the API calls that I'm allowed to make, the one that I wanted to use is called Get Form Data Array for Form ID. So all I need to do for that one is I need to fill in what the form ID is, which I just called DRF, Diagnose and Repair Form. Not very original, it's there. And then I said I wanted, with this timestamp, this is one of the parameters here, it needs to be after, and I gave it this hard-coded timestamp. I'll explain why I hard-coded it in a minute, of 2019, October 4th, so a few weeks ago. I also told it that I wanted to get the record count and a few other things. I wanted to resolve media fields. I'll talk about that a little bit later on. But so that I went ahead and I tested it, and it pulled out all of the ones that had been changed in transform since this particular date. With that done, all I had to do was click on this XBasic tab over here, and it gave me the XBasic programming code that I need to make that exact call. So I used that code and I pasted it into my own function called getLatestTFTickets. What getLatestTFTickets does is it pulls down all of it makes that API call and it returns all of the tickets that have occurred since a particular start time, and that'll be the SQL update time. And part of this code, this was all written for me again by Alpha Anywhere, all the way from this dim API key is C all the way down to end if. By the way, I've changed this API key, so don't copy it, it's not going to work. But one of the things that I found that I needed was in here, the URL. This is the URL that's being called in the API key. And I made this big so you can read it, but I know it's being cut off on the screen. So I'm going to shift the screen over and I'm going to show you part of that URL included a timestamp. It said where timestamp equals this. And this is what I had hard-coded before in that previous example. But what I wanted to do is not hard-code it, but actually use a variable timestamp. So I've inserted plus timestamp plus, and that is let me move my screen back over again. That is this here. This is a URL encoded version of the timestamp that I pass into the function. Hopefully I'm not confusing too many people. I know a lot of people here are somewhat technical and hopefully can follow along. So I pass that in, and what I get back, what I return is the results, which are basically an object pointer, which contains all of the transform forms that have been updated since the date that I asked for. Okay. So here we pull it all together. I'll show you what I did here. This looks like a really scary screen, but it's actually it isn't. Once I show you how it works, you realize there's a lot of repeats here. I begin at the very top of this function called update service calls table. This is the one that's supposed to take the latest data from transform and push it into my SQL database. And I started out by setting a variable called results, a pointer variable called results. And I used the getLatestTransformTickets function I just showed you. And I get it to pull down all the latest tickets since this particular time. And instead of hard coding in a time, I use the getLatestSQL timestamp function, which I showed you just a moment ago. So I use these two functions as part of this third function. And what I get back is a series of results. And if I were to look at the results and I were to type in something like results.result of X, because keep in mind this is an array, I can get back multiple forms, and then I put a field next to it like check 1 or check 2 or check 3, that is going to be the result that I get back. That's going to be the field value that I got back from transform. So what I've done for every single field I'm interested in is I've created a type of mapping here. So on the left side, these are the fields as they appear in the SQL table. These are their exact names: billable time, check 1, check 10, check 11, and all that. On the right side, this is the stuff that I'm getting back from transform. And if you'll notice, before each one of these lines, I've put in this comment called if eval valid, and then I've put in, for example, check 1 or check 2 or check 11, or oops, looks like I made a mistake. This should have been check 10 here. I get bad data. Check 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, whatever, as well as other things that were, the picture and whatever, all of the data basically that you're going to get back. The reason I'm using eval valid is because this is a JSON set of data that I'm getting back, I may not get back all the fields. If someone leaves a field blank in transform, it's not going to come back. So if I try to refer to that field in Alpha Anywhere, I'm going to get an error. So this is where eval valid comes in. It makes sure that the thing that you're looking for, in fact, exists and is correct before you set it to something. So all I did here was I put in some if statements and said, if this is valid, set this variable check 5 to results.result.check5. If this is valid, set check 7, and all the way down the line for each one of the fields that I have here. So that sets up a type of field mapping. Okay. Now at the bottom of the script, when I'm finished, I get to do something pretty clever, and that is, oops, keep in mind this is part of a loop. So for each part of the results set, I grab all of this and I set all of the variables. Then I continue on with the loop and I check to make sure that there is in fact a valid sample ID as one of the records that I get back, or one of the fields that I get back from transform. The reason I'm going to need that is because that's the key field in my sample database and I need to write to it. So what I do is I use this SQL update command in which I pass in the fields, and I pass in the key field and the key field name and the key field value so it knows what it needs to update, as well as my connection string to the SQL table, as well as the name of the table service calls. Now this particular field here, JSON fields, is a list of all of the fields that I updated in the previous, that I set here in this previous section. So I didn't have to refer to all of these fields again. I could have said, fields.check1 plus fields.check2 and so on right here in this JSON field section, but instead I used a really clever function called property to JSON. I'm going to hop down here and show it to you. And this property to JSON function, what it does is it takes a property value like the one I did a moment ago, and it actually converts it into the correct JSON format that I need for the field, so that it gets called here. So when that is done, as it loops through all the fields, it pulls out the ones that are updated, and it updates the data to the latest data. So that is the process from start to finish. I'm going to just review it one more time, a little bit faster. We decided that we wanted to use an ETL system because we wanted to keep local copies of our data because it was more efficient and more flexible when building out a web portal. To do that, we decided against using the define on submit action that's used for writing to databases because it doesn't have a failsafe, unlike our timer thing where if it does fail, it's going to try again in a few minutes. We created a system in which our dispatch screen writes to both the SQL table and to transform at the same time, and it takes the key field called SampleID and it connects both of the records together so that later on when the transform data is updated, we'll be able to update the SQL data as well. Next up, let's skip down here. Next up, we built 3 functions. The first one's job was to get the latest timestamp from our SQL database, so we know the last time the database was updated. We built another function that pulls out data from transform based on the timestamp, in fact, this timestamp. And then we wrote yet another function which has all of the field mappings here to write the data into the SQL database. And at the end, we have a complete and working system. So that is that. I hope I didn't confuse the heck out of too many people. For those of you who need to do ETL, I suspect you'll probably want to rewatch this video once or twice. And also, if you need access to any of my scripts or anything here, by all means, go ahead and send an email to tfservice@alphasoftware.com, and I'd be happy to get that off to you. So speaking of questions, are there any questions? If so, go ahead and type them into the questions box of the GoToWebinar control panel. No, it looks like we are all set for now. Great, wonderful. Well, hey, thank you very much for joining me. I hope to see you guys back here next Tuesday for another Transform Tuesday. In the meantime, if you do have any questions, go ahead and send them to tfservice, as in transform service, @alphasoftware.com. Thanks again. Hope to see you next week. Bye-bye.